say we introduce again government spending, right? So we now have this idea output equals consumption plus government spending, right? And then we before end up introducing a balanced budget, G equals T, so government spending has to be financed fully by current taxation. But here we make our lives easy and say current taxation is lump sum tax on households, which basically that means, like in terms of if you write down the first order conditions, this is really not doing a lot, right? Where basically the firm side is completely left unchanged because firms don't pay taxes here, it doesn't matter for them, right? Households, they pay these lump sum taxes, so that matters a bit, but it doesn't change their first order conditions, right? I mean, that's basically stuff we've seen before, right? Okay. But we can now look at what this is doing in the model, right? And I mean, maybe let me show you the IRS immediately. I apologize, these are also not too nice. I stole them from some other textbook, I think, but I hope you kind of understand the notation by now, right? This is actually a figure which is basically coming one-to-one from Dinar. I mean, once you've worked with that, you will realize this immediately. This is Dinar output. I'm not saying it's beautiful, but that's what you get, right? So this is impulse responses, right? Interpret this in exactly the same way as we've done before, right? This here is time, this is quarters, right? And the way to interpret all these variables, right? This will be consumption, government spending, this is the interest rate, this is inflation, the real interest rate, that's the nominal one, right? In that model, there's actually money, just ignore that, doesn't matter here, right? So forget about this thing here. This here is output. This is our output gap, right, that we were just discussing, and this here would be the flex price output, which I'm calling in my slides YF, right? So that's the flex price output, right? So what is fiscal policy doing? What can you see? Exactly, right? So you see here, government spending increases, right? A way to read this here, you get, I don't know, like a 1% deviation from steady state. So we're increasing government spending by 1% compared to steady state. That would be interpretation here. And you see that private consumption falls, right? So that's very similar to what we've seen in the RBC and the neoclassical growth model, right? Anything else?
Because we increase government spending, I also increases our investment, and
that's actually confusing. When I looked at this yesterday, I had exactly the same problem. This is the nominal interest rate.
Yes.
This model doesn't even have investment because it's in the phasing model, right?
But then again, this also makes sense because we have more government spending, the interest rate also.
Yeah.
Is the dual interest rate response then again like an implied Ricardian equivalence mechanic?
Is this Ricardian equivalence? Very good question. One.
If the households consume less and investments go up, thereby raising interest rates, one could assume that the savings rate goes up in anticipation of future lower government consumption or higher taxation in order to refinance that. So that's why I'm assuming, but I'm not sure if it's correct.
So what was the Ricardian equivalent?
Households save more in expansionary fiscal shock if it is financed via debt. One could assume that, like it was paribus, so to say, in anticipation that future taxation will be higher, therefore saving this fiscal shock.
Yeah. And the Ricardian equivalence applies, if this is true, right, that it does not matter whether government finances the increase in G by taxation or by debt, right? That's the equivalence result of Ricardian equivalence, right? Ricardian equivalence is not at all about fiscal multipliers, right? Macroeconomic equivalence doesn't tell you anything about whether fiscal policy is expansionary or not. The Macroeconomic equivalence is only about, does it matter whether the current fiscal expansion is financed by debt or taxation? And you're right, here it wouldn't matter. In a new Keynesian model, as far as I'm not, I hope I'm right. But I think in like how this model is presented, Macroeconomic equivalence still holds. You can in a new Keynesian model, you can break it relatively easily by doing simple stuff. For example, as soon as you make the taxes discretionary, let's say you would introduce a labor tax, already then Macroeconomic equivalence would break. But here I think it does not matter, right? Or Macroeconomic equivalence holds, right? So it wouldn't matter. So let's say you were to write down the model instead of with this guy here, right? I mean, here I'm assuming we're financing the current government spending completely with taxes, right? Remember, I think in the RDC, right? So we also defined it differently. There are also introduced government debt. I think we called it DT, right? I said, okay, let's assume the government finances that with debt. Here, this also wouldn't make any difference, right? I'm not fully mistaken how this correct what I'm saying.
You know, I just forgot already. Why have you cut out M from the
Because I was just like, the model that's simulated here has a money spending rule. There is money in that model. The model version that I have shown you does not have money. This is money supply. I've never shown you a new Keynesian model of money supply. You can do this, just that's why I said just forget about it, right? Let's say if you were to open the Gali textbook, this is exactly how he does it. This is where this is in there, but it's for us, it really doesn't matter. It's basically if you want to think about how does the central bank actually implement the change in interest rate, and then you put in money demand again, a bit like you would do with, like, say, an LM world, right? That's what you can also do with these models. Okay. So yeah, so like what did we always say? We said many things already, right? So government spending increases. You said there is this crowding out of consumption, and you said there's this increase in the nominal interest rate. Why does the nominal interest rate increase?
Assume it's because investment increases the savings.
This model does not have any investment, right? There's no capital here. There's savings, that's true. So, but I would actually say it's the other way around, right? I mean, consumption falls because the nominal interest rate goes up, right? So people save more because their savings. But what's actually driving this increase in the nominal interest rate?
I believe it's the rise in inflation, which results in the rise of output.
Yeah, right? Here. I mean, I know this notation is not super nice. This here is inflation, right? So what you see here happening, right? I mean, you have government spending going up. There's a bit of crowding out for private consumption, but still output increases, right? So you see here that output here, GDP here, increases by 0.5%. Right? So firms produce more. Demand goes up, right? Firms produce more. This is not for free, right? I mean, if you look at the firm problem, what will they do? They will see, okay, I can actually sell more. I will increase my prices, right? Increasing prices, that's what you see here, right? Inflation will go up. It will not go up fully because of the calvo, right? There is price stickiness. Only some firms can increase prices, but some firms will do this, right? This generates inflation. And who's responding to inflation?
Central bank.
Right? And it's the central bank that's now increasing the nominal interest rate. That's our Taylor rule, right? So basically the central bank sees inflation goes up and there is now output going up and also the output gap going up, right? And I mean, just look at the Taylor rule, sorry for jumping, but just to show you the equation, right? If inflation goes up and the output gap goes up, output goes up, we're going in a boom, right? So what the central bank will do immediately, it will say, okay, then we increase the nominal interest rate. And this is then where households say, okay, wait, there's an increase in the nominal interest rate, right? I increases. Inflation increases too. Also my inflation expectation increase because this is sticky and whatever. But also the real interest rate will go up, right? Because inflation always increases less compared to the nominal interest rate, right? And this is why they reduce their consumption, right? They save more, they save more, consume less, right? That's exactly what he was saying before, right? And this is driving this crowding out of private consumption, right? And then you're basically there, right? This is what gives you the effects of the fiscal policy shock here, right? You do get, I mean, just in terms of, I mean, I was always saying we try to always understand fiscal policy in terms of this government spending multiplier. So what's the government spending multiplier here? Right? I mean, this multiplier would be something like, how does output change to government spending? What is that guy?
0.5 here?
Yeah, it's actually, you can basically read it off, right? You have 0.5 and there you have 1. So this thing is clearly positive, right? So this is a positive effect of government spending on GDP, right? And I mean, this is again, right? This is a Keynesian style model. Demand matters here, right? So if the government increases government spending, you get exactly that. You get more demand in your economy and that increases output, right? So you go in a boom if you want so, right? But the point is, that increases inflation. And on inflation, you will have a response from your central bank, right? Because the central bank wants to bring inflation back to steady state. And this is then what drives our private consumption. And this is why this multiplier here is not 1, but is smaller than 1, right? Because we see this crowding out, as we were saying earlier, right? Okay. This is basically my first point here, right? But this is very different compared to the RBC, right? Or to the neoclassical growth model. And the reason here is that we have now a model we can actually like talk about demand, right? Demand is playing some role. The main reason is the price stickiness, right? You can actually nicely try this here in the model, but I hope all the intuition is clear, right? If you basically prevent prices from rising, right? Say you increase this price stickiness, right? So basically you like go in your economy and say I increase this Calvert parameter such that less and less firms are actually able to increase prices. The higher is the price stickiness, the lower will be the response of inflation here, the lower will then be the response of the central bank, the lower will be the crowding out, and the higher will be the government spending multiplier, right? So this model has this very clear prediction: the more sticky are prices, the higher is the government spending multiplier. Right? I mean, this is also something which is, I think, very intuitive and what many people have in mind, right? I mean, if I teach an undergraduate macro course, I basically say exactly the same, right? Take an ISLM, the prices are completely sticky, you get the maximum multiplier. If you and then think about, I don't know, an ASAD model where you have somewhat more flexible prices but not completely flexible, this is exactly what's happening, right? It's just the same here. Only difference is that it took us a long way to do all these micro foundations, but this is still there, right? So this is why I always say, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why people like this new Keynesian model. It gives you some of these like very intuitive predictions, right, that we have in mind. Okay, so that's that one. Yeah, and it has this also very clear prediction that the effects of fiscal policy will depend on what the second player here is doing. It will depend on what the central bank is doing, right? Have you ever heard this term of accommodative central bank policy? What is that? And I mean, you can see it, right? So an more accommodative central bank would be a central bank that would basically say, okay, we see government spending is going up, right? The government is, I don't know, buying new military goods, right? We're investing in defense now. Demand increases. This drives up prices. But we don't want to crowd out demand, private demand. This is why we are not increasing the nominal interest rate as much. So that would be accommodative policy in the sense of the central bank would say, okay, we let inflation increase, but we don't want to kind of like kill this expansionary effect of the original monetary policy, the fiscal policy shock, right? So more accommodative policy, central bank policy would be one that would be setting a lower, where is it here? Lower coefficient on inflation here. But obviously there's a danger, right? I mean, if they do that, they basically, they let inflation go through, right? So there's trade-offs involved. But this is like one of these findings where we say, already in this model, right? For the effects of fiscal policy, it matters what monetary policy is doing, right? So, I mean, we always say these two guys are independent, right? Fiscal policy and monetary policy ideally should be independent, but it's not like the one does not interact with the other. They do, right? They do to a very large degree, and this is already one of the key points where you can see it, right? You can obviously also put it the other way around, right? If you have a model with fiscal policy, government debt, the government or like the fiscal response will also shape the monetary policy transition. They always do, right? Because both of these institutions, policymakers, are large and matter for our economy, right? So that will always interact. Right? Okay. Yeah, I mean, maybe as kind of the most extreme case, right? So to say, what would be the most accommodative central bank policy? And I bet you've seen that, right? That's what, like in an ISLM, I call a liquidity trap. If we are at the zero lower bound, the central bank will not respond at all, right? At the zero lower bound, this guy here, the nominal interest rate, would stay constant, right? And then you would get the maximum multiplier from fiscal policy. And again, that's the story that we already tell in an ISLM model, right? If you are in a liquidity trap, if you are at the zero lower bound, monetary policy becomes ineffective, fiscal policy becomes as effective as it can be, right? And I mean, here the nice thing is, right, this is a quantitative model, and I mean, many people have worked on that. You can actually like really quantify that. You can show that in these cases, the multiplier can actually become substantially larger than 1, right? Which means then you're really back into this Keynesian multiplier idea, where the fiscal multiplier is not only 1, where it becomes actually larger than 1, right? And this can happen. Yeah, there's a huge literature on that, right? We're just pointing out one here. But there's lots on that, right? I mean, obviously, this is one of the things that many people thought about. Okay. Questions?
This is maybe a little bit unrelated, but is the multiplier sensitive to what sectors it's like destroyed, so in what sectors you're spending the money on? Yeah.
What would you explain? What would you have in mind?
I don't know, like if you send it all in, if you spend 100 billion euros on the military, which is just like, it's not really investment, it's just like a consumption spending, and it's not really gonna come back in the economy in terms of like, the whole cycle. If you spend on infrastructure, maybe it would.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's true, right? There's also people that thought about this, but it's a very interesting point what you raise, because very often we do treat government spending really just as this government consumption, this G, right? Which is not doing any positive to your economy. It's just consumption, right? There is some literature that also looks a bit something like more like government investment. I think that's what you have a bit in mind, right? So they say if you talk about infrastructure, and then this is more like investment, which will actually not only do something today, but what could increase, I don't know, your capital stock maybe, and then you get long-term effects, right? Because your trades suddenly go on time again, right? Whatever, right? And I mean, yeah, this is also true for military expenditure. I mean, there's There's actually this one guy from the LSE, Howard Zurico. I don't know, maybe you can Google him. He was just here for a conference in December. We had a conference on fiscal policy. And he's currently writing papers on basically what can we do with all this military spending to invest that in a sensible way such that it does not only just get consumed. So he's really making this point, we should target this towards R&D. And he's basically, what he did, he looked at US data and he was like trying to understand, I mean, the US has a long history of military spending and has a history of R&D, right? We're kind of trying to get this together, and it really shows like what do we have to do in order to make sure that this military spending generates R&D. And he basically, the point he keeps making, that's just what I remember from that conference, was he was saying, you should not invest it in Rheinmetall, it's the worst thing you can do. And he was actually, it's a point he's pushing also in our ministries currently, because he's basically going there and telling them, don't do this. You kind of have to like invest more in, and maybe even in startups, right? But you cannot just invest in these firms that have been doing this for ages. Then you will just get what you got in the last 30 years, and that didn't help us that much. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's that simple, right? I mean, sometimes as macro people, we tend to make the world a bit too simple, and I believe that maybe this may be true in that regard too. But he's really making a very strong point about this, and I mean, you can find all his papers on his webpage. I mean, it's over there if you're interested. Yeah, I mean, he's currently really trying to push that because obviously it's one of the things that we currently care about, right? But I mean, just maybe to answer your question, I mean, where I want to go in my chapter 7, I think in my chapter 7 I will not talk about government spending. But in chapter 7, where I want to endogenize growth, right? I mean, that goes a bit in that direction because if you, let's say, if you combine a growth model with fiscal spending, then you could get this in a way, right? So as I always say, you have all the machinery now. So you could, in principle, do this, and there's also papers that do it. Yeah, no. All right. So yeah, this is always the slide. So what do we think now of the new Keynesian model, right? And I mean, the new Keynesian model has been around for 30 years now, at least, right? I think many people have worked on that. We do understand it actually pretty well, I hope. So, I mean, there's like these common criticisms, right? If you open any textbook, that's what you will see. So there's like one of the major problems that the new Keynesian model has, but also the RBC model has, right? Is what we call there is not enough persistence amplification. So basically what this refers to is actually very simple. It just refers to the point that if you look at whatever shock, take a technology shock, the persistence, let's say, in output is basically driven just by this productivity shock, right? It's not like there's anything happening in output here which does not come out of this exogenous shock, right? I mean, in a way, what I say now should sound very familiar to you. I mean, that's also what I said in these growth models, why we said basically we're assuming growth to be exogenous, right? And here, to a very large degree, we are also assuming our business cycle to be exogenous, right? And this is just true, right? This has been documented, I mean, a lot, right? There's a huge literature, right? I mean, you can also solve this to some degree, basically by making your models larger, right? I mean, you can make these models much, much larger, right? As you see new Keynesian models that people run in central banks. This is not just these 3 equations, but they are typically open economy, and then maybe you add different sectors. You will add all kind of other rigidities, maybe financial markets, labor markets, whatever, and then these models become very, very large, right? And there's ways to kind of solve this, but very often, this depends a bit on whether you're like a policy person. Policymakers are very often happy with these large models. These like, I don't know, these academic people, we typically say we want our models to be as small as possible, but to explain as much as possible, right? Because the problem with these large models is at some point you're not understanding anymore what's going on, right? So that's the pros and cons there. Right? But there is, I mean, you have the list, right? There's all the stuff you can do if you're interested, look into this. But it's just like, if you ever heard that like New Keynesian models do not amplify, have not enough persistence, this is true, right? And this is basically what I'm saying here, right? What is also true for New Keynesian models is this problem with the labor supply elasticity. This is actually the same slides that I already discussed in the RBC model. That also holds here, right? And in a way, it's not surprising that this is holding here too, because our households, our labor market here is working exactly the same way as in the RBC, right? So you still have this problem that basically what we do here in the macro data is not consistent with what we do in the micro data. But again, basically the same stories in the RBC hold. I would say if you take your labor market more seriously, you can actually work on this, right? This is to me one of the most fundamental critiques of the New Keynesian model, right? I mean, the New Keynesian model really started off as a model of monetary policy, central banking. It doesn't have financial markets, right? And I mean, this is basically the thing that basically, like, after the financial crisis, right, many people said, yeah, that was really maybe a bit too far, right? And there's a whole literature, right, which really took off under the financial crisis, but I mean, also some people have done that before, right, to introduce financial market frictions, so they say like banks, right, into these models. You can do these, right, so there's very established ways how this can be done. And this is just kind of the two most important ways, and I mean, that's always like, I would always say, that's why the New Keynesian model is nice. You can, like, whatever you want to study, you can put that in, right? Once you understand how this model works, how these techniques work, do that. Whether you want to put in unemployment, or whether you want to put in banks, or whatever, feel free to, right? And I mean, basically, this has been done too, right? Okay, yeah, maybe let's have a break first, and then I'll finish the other part later. Thanks for coming again.
Und dann mal nach innen und außen. Kleine Bewegung, geht auch. Innen, außen, innen, außen, innen, außen, innen, außen. Dann schütteln wir einmal die Arme aus und machen einmal Armkreisen. Verschafft ein bisschen Platz zu eurem Nebenmenschen. Genau. Und in die andere Richtung. Erst mal locker ankreisen. Diese sehr lange Arme müssen noch ein bisschen rutschen. Okay, und dann starten wir mit den Armen oben und jetzt geht ein Arm nach vorne und einer geht nach hinten. So, genau. Das sind die ersten Seite. Okay, also nochmal ein Arm kreist nach vorne, einer kreist nach hinten. Und dann wird es noch schlimmer, jetzt halten wir an und nochmal Richtungswechsel, also anders als eben. Versucht nochmal reinzukommen, dass das Gehirn versteht, was ihr wollt, und dann geht's los. Ja, genau. Okay, sehr gut. Und locker lassen und ausschütteln. Immer wieder schütteln. Und dann marschieren wir mal kräftig auf der Stelle und zieht das Knie so hoch wir können. Genau, ihr könnt auch gern seitlich. Locker noch einmal nach dem langen Sitzen alles aus. Das geht noch ein bisschen dynamischer. Genau, sehr schön. Wir machen noch 3, 2, 1. Sehr gut. Und dann machen wir mit den Füßen das gleiche wie eben mit den Händen. Wir kippen die Fußgelenke, also Fuß anziehen und strecken. Und dann auch hier einmal nach innen und außen und innen und außen und innen und außen und innen und außen. Und dann am anderen Fuß einmal strecken und anziehen. Knack, knack, ja. Und dann auch einmal winkeln nach innen und außen. Viele Bänder ermöglichen auch diese Bewegung. Nach innen, außen. Einmal noch. Und die Beine ausschütteln. Die vorletzte Übung. Wir legen uns einmal die Hand ans Gesicht und drücken dann aber das Gesicht in die Hand. Ja, wir spannen also den Kopf und den Hals zur Seite an und lassen ganz bewusst lockern. Also nicht Hand an den Kopf, sondern nochmal Kopf an die Hand drücken, anspannen und bewusst entspannen. Und nochmal. Kopf, Nacken, Schulter anspannen, nach außen drücken und locker lassen. Und einmal auf der anderen Seite. Wir spannen an und lassen ganz bewusst los. Und nochmal. Anspannen, entspannen und einmal noch anspannen, entspannen. Sehr gut. Und dann noch was ganz Entspanntes zum Schluss. Wir lassen Kopf und Arme pendeln, schließen mal kurz die Augen und lassen dann einmal die Arme so um den Körper schwingen. Der Kopf hängt ganz locker. Kurz einmal eine Pause machen und an nichts denken, nur schwingen. Und dann langsam wieder aufrichten, Kopf wieder mit nach oben, Augen wieder öffnen und dann geht's weiter. Bis nächste Woche.
Typical critiques on the new Keynesian model, which I mean, I'm not saying that this is not true, right? I mean, this is all true. But sometimes I'm also a bit like, I mean, if you just write down 3 equations, you shouldn't really explain it and not explain the homework, right? This is also true, right? This is one thing that was discussed actually really a lot, and it still is. Because I mean, as I kind of motivated the whole thing, the new Keynesian model is like the model that we used for central bank policy making, right? We talked about forward guidance, right? And I was basically saying the new Keynesian model gives you the story why forward guidance matters, right? If you think about the new Keynesian Phillips curve and so on, right? But at some point, people, and I mean, this is people from the New York Facts, right? I mean, they got really close to this, right? They basically try to understand what this model really implies for forward guidance. And what they documented is that forward guidance in these models actually works too well. It works infinitely well, if you want so, right? And the reason is actually very simple, and you can basically see it from these 3 equations. So what are my 3 equations? Sorry, so far. If you look at the Euler equation, right? So if you look here, right, before we talked about the new Keynesian Phillips curve, now think about the Euler equation, right? Solve this here for current output, right? So think about putting the inflation here, the future output on the right-hand side. Then you see that current output depends on future output plus the real interest rate, right? And now you can basically say, now I solve this forward, right? So if this here holds in t, this also holds in t plus 1. And then you can write this, that current output will basically depend on all expectations of future real interest rates, right? So basically what I'm doing now is exactly what we did with the new Keynesian Phillips curve. There we did it for inflation. Now do the same, right? Now do that for output. Then what you see is that current output will depend on all expectations of the future real interest rate. But the point is, there's no beta here, right? So these future or these interest rate expectations are not discounted at all. And this is exactly what these people have looked at. And then they say, this is why forward guidance, even if the central bank would say, in 100 years, we do whatever such that the real interest rate is very low, right? This will already have immediate, very high effects today, right? And this is obviously nonsense, right? This is clear, right? But it falls out directly from this equation, and I mean, if there's something not working well in your model, you call this a puzzle, and then you try thinking about this, right? Problem is a bit that this new like this Euler equation is really at the heart of the model, right? This is one of the things that changes tremendously once you go towards Hank models. This is actually what I want to talk about next, right? But whenever you open new Keynesian, monetary policy, forward guidance, that's the thing you will see, right? So these models do have this problem, right? Okay. Good. That's our so-called forward guidance puzzle, right? So, as I said, it's nice about the new Keynesian model that forward guidance works there and you can understand it, but it works too well, right? Okay. Yeah, this is again just one of these, right? I mean, obviously, if once you have the zero lower bound, monetary policy works very differently, right? Forward guidance is one of these examples. This is one of these papers that came also after the financial crisis and is actually really also taking the financial markets seriously, and they use this to model unconventional monetary policy. So they're basically modeling these asset purchases by central banks, right? That's what they do. And I just always have this on the slide to tell you this is also something you can do with these models, right? I mean, if you were thinking like, she's talking about this Taylor rule, isn't that a bit too simple? Yes, sure, that's very much too simple, right? But you can also extend these models and do stuff like unconventional monetary policies. Okay. Questions so far? Okay. So then let me try to give you a bit of an idea, because I've said that repeatedly, right? That what we nowadays do is not only the new Keynesian part, but is what we call HANK. And HANK is a heterogeneization new Keynesian model, right? So the NK in HANK is exactly what you've seen, right? That's the part you know, right? And this is why I kind of put this in this chapter here, right? Because it exactly builds on all that, right? But basically, I don't know, to whatever macro conference you would go to, also lots of the current policy work, also in central banks, is always now basically, I mean, in central banks, it's actually currently changing a lot. So if for example, if I look at job ads, right, so what like in central banks, what they really want nowadays is PhDs from us that are able to work with HANK models, for example, right? Because like these people that they hired 10 years ago, they were not able to do this. But the people that they hire now, they want them to do this, right? So this is also where I'm talking about this a bit, right? Okay, so what is HANK doing, right? What is this heterogeneization part? So basically, what you do is to relax this assumption of this infinitely lived representative households. What we're typically not relaxing is the infinitely lived, and you can also do this. That would be like an OLG model. I think I talked about this before. But what I want to relax now really is this idea of this representative household, right? Instead, we make households heterogeneous. How could households be heterogeneous? What do you think? What could be interesting?
Different income levels.
Yeah. That's exactly what we're doing here, right? Different income levels. And because of that, also different wealth levels, right? So some people earn a lot during their lifetime. These guys will be wealthy at some point. Some people will maybe not earn so much. They may be unemployed. These people will be poor, right? And that's exactly what these models take into account, right?
Does this also include different consumption and saving preferences?
Exactly. Not necessarily preferences. The preferences will be the same, but if I have nothing and you have a lot, you can consume much more than I will, right? That's basically what's happening then, right? So I mean, these people will all like to consume, but some can and some cannot, right? So that we're generating constraints here then, right? Okay. I mean, I'm just like basically asking this general question because obviously you could also think about other stuff, right? I mean, you could also think about heterogeneity in terms of, I don't know, some people have a high skill, others have more low skill. You could have different occupations, you could have different ages, you could have different gender, right? I mean, heterogeneity opens many different boxes, right? And I mean, you can actually, like, I mean, there's papers around like that too, right? I mean, for example, we have a whole branch of macro that we nowadays call more like these family macro models, which try to think about fertility, labor supply, and where you take gender seriously, right? You would actually be modeling household composition, right? And stuff like that, right? But from this HANK perspective, it's always what we just said, right? Different income levels, and because of that, different wealth levels. So some people are rich, some are poor. That's the very simple idea. It's not that simple, it's obviously very important, right? That's exactly why they do this. Right? So what that means in this model is that what we are including something that we call idiosyncratic risk to labor productivity. So that's not very accurate. Basically, just what it means is think about these households and their utility function and their budget constraint, right? This looks exactly the same, right? If you open a hand paper, you will see a household problem that looks very similar compared to what you know, right? And this is why I always start what I do first, right? But then the difference is that these people, their wage income, their labor income, right? Where we just always had the aggregate wage and hours worked. This wage will then depend on what I call here this idiosyncratic labor shock, right? So basically, in one period you can be a high productivity person and you will get a very high income, whereas in another period you can be a low income guy and then you will be very poor, right? That's basically what's happening. And I mean, what's nice of this literature, and I mean, this is also something that I actually do a lot, is we are taking the micro data that typically very seriously, right? So you really try to match individual risks, right? Also across the life cycle, across the business cycle, across the wealth distribution of getting high and low income shocks, right? So then it's really not just, I mean, before we were talking about this aggregate productivity shock, right? And I mean, I think I was making fun of that before, right? What exactly is that? I mean, it's this A shock, whatever, right? But here suddenly we really take that very seriously, right? You're looking at individual people, understanding their income over the life cycle, right, over the business cycle, and that's what you use in order to match this, right? But this literature is actually, I mean, this year is, we know how to do this since the 90s, right? So I mean, this is again something, I mean, like this hasn't been taking off in like the last 5 to 10 years maybe, but you will find macro models from the 90s that do this, right? Now you could actually say, if you understand these macro models well, right, I mean, why should I care about this idiosyncratic productivity shock? As long as there's a perfect financial market, and this is happening in these models, right? So far as what I showed you, it wouldn't matter if I have a negative productivity shock today, because I mean, I can just take up a loan, I can go to the financial market. If some other person has a positive shock, I can just borrow from that person, and basically we pool all that together, and then overall it doesn't matter, right? So if you were just to introduce these idiosyncratic shocks, that wouldn't change the whole story. What you need to put into the model in addition is what we call imperfect markets, in that case an imperfect financial market, where you would introduce something like borrowing limits, right? So basically the idea would be, if I'm a very poor guy, I have basically no savings, then I cannot borrow. I'm at the borrowing constraint, and then I cannot lend, right? And this is why I cannot smooth my consumption anymore. And I mean, we were talking about Ricardian equivalence before, right? This immediately breaks Ricardian equivalence, right? Because Ricardian equivalence is always this idea, if I expect taxes to increase in the future or to decrease in the future, I will basically borrow against that potentially. If I'm at the borrowing constraint, I cannot, right? And then this is immediately gone. So Ricardian equivalence in these models is not there, right? Right. But it's also true that this is not true for everyone, right? I mean, there's also rich people in this model. They can borrow, right? So that's I mean, exactly the beauty, right? You have this heterogeneity. You have all these different people interacting, right? But I mean, this sounds complicated. It's also much more complicated to solve, to admit, right? The reason why this is taking off so much in recent years is that some very smart people have developed very nice and reliable ways to solve these models, right? So like we are entering more and more kind of, I don't know, I'm not saying that this is something you can do in 2 weeks, definitely not. But if you invest some time, there's ways to actually understand how this works and to simulate these models, right? So this has become more doable than it was like 10 or 20 years ago, right? And this is really why this literature is currently taking off, right? So what this will give you at some point, again, is an Euler equation, is an IS. relationship, right? So if you write down these models, you do get an Euler equation, but it looks very different because this Euler equation will depend on the individual assets, the individual wealth that each person, each household in your model has. So it will depend on the distribution of, first of all, income, but more importantly, even wealth, right? So you can suddenly think about income, wealth distributions in your macro models, what they imply for all the kind of shocks that you may be putting in. Right? Okay. Again, this has already been documented in the 90s, but this is taking off now. One reason being that there was this paper here, which I'm citing, it's one of the very prominent ones, and they do it in the context of monetary policy. This is where this all started. But this also matters for fiscal policy, it matters for all kind of things, right? This is what many people are kind of working on. Because what they so clearly showed, and this was new at the time, is that this distribution now plays a role for example, monetary policy shocks. So the story that they tell you in this paper that I'm citing here, Monetary Policy According to Hank, is that they show that the monetary policy shock will have a different effect on inflation and GDP depending on whether you have an equal equal wealth or more unequal wealth distribution in your country, right? So this means two important things, right? First of all, it means that the central bank should care about the distribution of wealth in your country, right? It has to take that into account. And the second thing that this clearly shows is that monetary policy can also affect the wealth distribution, right? In these rank models, they cannot. It's just by construction, it's not there, right? And I mean, this is a theoretical argument, right, that you have on the other side. You have the whole empirical literature, which is then basically trying to make the argument, is that true, right? And I mean, this is still up to discussion, right? This paper, they argue very clearly that you see these interactions. I also know papers coming out just now who now say, maybe it's actually not so important as we thought 5 years ago, right? So this is really like the most, I don't know, like research frontier or whatever you want to call that, where we currently are, right? And this is also what I wanted to talk about. You should probably stop me, otherwise I'll not talk about that for too long, right? But this is clearly, I mean, I would say interesting. It's interesting, right? Because I mean, we could talk about stories about inequality, so many people care about this. But it's also method-wise. This was really a huge step for macro, right? Because I mean, for years we were doing these representative agents. I mean, many people were not like big fans of that, right? And this is like, and now we can actually do the other stuff too, right? So this was like I would say in terms of these, both ways to think about it. In terms of content, this is very nice, but also in terms of like how like in terms of macro was evolving over time. This was really a huge step. Okay, but again, right, this is happening in a micro-founded DSGE model with optimizing agents and whatever, right? So like all the stuff that I talked about during this course still matters here, right? So that's why I invested so much time talking about this, right? Because you need this if you want to do this, right? Okay. Good. Right. Questions?
It doesn't go too far, but like how advanced is the empirical research in that regard, given like the difficulties with measuring wealth?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we very often look at income, right? So I mean, which is true for all kind of literatures, right? And I mean, here actually it works because you can basically take the income distribution and then your model would imply a wealth distribution out of that, which you then can again put against the data, but you don't necessarily always need to start with a wealth distribution. But I mean, you're right? I mean, we were not observing the top incomes, right? Which is exactly the problem with measuring wealth. But I mean, I think there's also great work there. But what we really like typically do is really to match these income distributions first of all, and then from that your model would give you the wealth distribution. Very good point. Actually, these models, I mean, I was just saying they're able to match a distribution, right? This is true. One of the things which always shows up if you work with Hank is you get a distribution, but the wealth distribution that you typically get in these models is by far not wide enough compared to what you see in the data, right? And then you can say basically, do I really care about matching the wealth distribution? And then there's stuff you can put into the models, but that goes a bit like, as what I said, right, with these other critique points, right? It starts to become a bit ad hoc, we would say, right? You could add different heterogeneities, for example, right, to get this. But this is generally true, right? In terms of really matching the wealth distributions, one of the things we're working on, I would say, also in the models, not only in the data. But. So if you're interested in that, I mean, I should stop talking about this at some point, but there is, so Benjamin Moll, for example, was one of these persons who was at LSE working on that a lot, and he was almost 2 years ago now, giving a keynote at the World Economic Society, 2024. I think the video is still online, and that is really, really nice. So if you want to get an idea of what all this is about, I totally recommend that. I actually stole this slide from that presentation here. It's just like to give you a very short idea what this whole literature opens up, and this is why macro people, if they talk about this, become very excited, right? So basically, this is about monetary policy transmission, right? Just this one shock that we talked about. And what basically these hand people have shown is that once you allow for this heterogeneity, these distributions, you will open up whole new channels of monetary policy that we have never before thought about, right? So in a rank model, it's basically all about this intertemporal substitution effect. That's the one we talked about too, right? When we talked about the Euler equation, I at some point also said there's this intertemporal substitution effect, because if I expect that wages go up in the future, I will do something, whatever, right? That is the rank transmission, right? You can see that here, right? So that goes back to people like Woodford, Galliburg. That's basically what we talked about, right? And I mean, I shouldn't talk about all this here, but just to show you this has basically come all like, I mean, this is really like from the last 10 years, right? So that's what I'm saying, this is exploding at the moment. We're really like opening up all these different other transmission mechanisms. And maybe let me just give you one of them, which the ones I think is actually very relevant, and maybe one of the most interesting one is that one here, which is actually a very intuitive one. If I now tell you about it, you would probably say, why have you not done this before, right? But basically what happens, right, under monetary policy. Let's say there's a contraction in monetary policy shock. Demand falls. This implies something for the equilibrium, right? So it's a general equilibrium effect that we then see, which means that firms will hire less, right? Demand falls, firms will produce less, they will hire fewer workers, right? Or they will pay lower wages, doesn't matter, right? Both will work. Which means that labor income for households falls, right? This is also true in a rank model, right? So rank is representative agent, just to say that, right? So that's basically what we've seen before, right? This is also true there, but in these models, this effect is just basically tiny, doesn't matter much, right? In a hand model, because you have all these people at the borrowing constraint, you have all these people that just don't have much, that are poor, this suddenly matters a lot, right? And you're basically really getting all these new transmission through the labor market, for example, of monetary policy that before, I mean, it has been there, but basically the belief has been this effect is not strong, just doesn't matter much, right? And now we're basically trying to show whether it matters empirically, and I mean, as I said, this is really up to discussion. There's some papers saying it does matter a lot, but I've also seen papers saying it doesn't matter much, right? It could also depend on your labor market structure, it will depend on all kind of things, right? But this is really stuff that we're currently trying to think about. Right. I mean, another thing, you could also think about asset markets, right? That would basically be the other part of the distribution, right? I mean, monetary policy changes maybe how, I don't know, something in the stock market, right? Suddenly, these people that are very rich, that hold many assets, right, hold stocks, they might now be richer than they were before, right? What do they do, right? How do they then adjust their consumption? And this then again has effects on the aggregate economy, right? And this is exactly what these models allow us to study. Right? Okay. Again, if you want to know more, feel free to watch the video. I think it's super nice and can explain that much better way than I can. Maybe just shortly, do you know what an MPC is? What is the MPC? I think I've talked about that too, right? Yeah? I hope so. Right, that's this thing that we've already been talking about as an undergraduate, right? And the thing is, in a hand, this guy is suddenly important again. It's suddenly very important. It's basically the parameter that we try to talk about all the time. The main difference in a hand model is that if you open an ISLM, right, there you would also see the MPC, because the MPC determines the government spending on the quantifier. But there the MPC is an exogenous parameter. You put something in, right, and then you can say, is that 0.5 or 0.7, whatever, right? Here, this thing becomes endogenous. So it becomes an endogenous thing, and it even changes across the wealth distribution. So what these models imagine, that's basically this figure here, is that if you're a poor person, right, so what I'm plotting here is the wealth distribution. This is people that don't have a lot of, here's a liquid wealth that I'm conditioning on. I am very poor. This figure tells you, then you have a high MPC. If you are relatively rich, your MPC will be lower, but it's actually also driven by different stuff, right? So that's what the hand model argues. And this is then also one of the reasons why these distributions matter so much, right? Because they drive these Keynesian multipliers and whatever. Good. So there's this, it's like the MPC coming back. So that's also true. There's actually a relatively recent paper which is called the New Keynesian Cross. I don't know if you maybe feel free to open it. It's relatively technical. But I mean, you know what the Keynesian Cross is? Right? The Keynesian Cross is really like this multiplier idea, right? Demand generates supply, and this is where everybody becomes richer, right? And in these models, you get this new Keynesian cross. So that's exactly what they show, but they also show how it differs, because that's also different in some respects. But yeah, this is what many of us keeps busy at the moment. Okay. Yeah, that's kind of my short slides talk about the hang. Good. But again, right, this is also why I think understanding all these other parts is like starting with the rank, that's what you need, right? Otherwise you would never go there, right? And I don't know, maybe in a couple of years I will start teaching the hang immediately in a master's course, but I'm not sure.
Sorry, can you go back to the previous graph?
Sure.
And can you explain the red line?
The red line?
Yeah, just plain.
Okay, that will take a bit, but okay, let me try. Okay, so what you do in a hang model, you basically differentiate everything by this direct and indirect effects, right? So the direct effect is basically monetary policy changes the interest rate, and this affects the Euler equation, this affects households' consumption saving, right? Interest rate, Euler equation, households' demand. That's the direct effect. Right? We would also say that's the partial equilibrium effect. Right?
What is that partial equilibrium effect?
Because you're not yet taking into account, it's just about to get there, you're not yet taking into account that in general equilibrium, firms will respond, other markets will respond. So,
is that Florian Sand or sustainability taken into account?
sorry, is that what?
Okay, so it's another story, so never mind. I cannot read that a substitution, right, is not sustainable effect. It's so small that I cannot read that, like what you red circled.
Yeah, I mean, so the intertemporal substitution effect is a direct effect, right? Because that works directly via the Euler equation.
And what that mean?
What that means?
Yeah.
So the intertemporal substitution effect, I mean, for that you can basically go back to what we were discussing in the RDC, right? If you think about the change of the interest rate, how that affects the Euler equation, we were like basically decomposing that in two effects, in the intertemporal elasticity of substitution and the wealth effect. Open chapter 4, I think, or 5, right? And then we were saying the intertemporal elasticity of substitution effect is basically if you're expecting that in the future the path of interest rates or your path of income will be something, you will already be changing your behavior today. That's intertemporal, because the Euler equation is forward-looking, right? In the Euler equation, my current consumption depends on my expectations about interest rates, about my expectations about future income.
If tomorrow not happening?
If tomorrow, yeah, I mean, these people are infinitely live, tomorrow happens.
How to say?
But that's a model, right? I mean, that's...
So to say, that is kind of not true effect. So that is kind of like...
Yeah, I mean, you can write down an OLG if you want, right? I mean, write down an OLG model with just two people, two periods, you get exactly the same. And people die.
Okay.
So that doesn't take it off. I mean, the story of the intertemporal substitution effect is, if there's something, I mean, basically it's about expectations, right? If you say expectations don't matter, then if this effect doesn't matter, that's true. But I mean, we do also know that they do matter to some degree, right? I mean, in a way, it's a bit like what this figure here is showing, right? I mean, you were actually asking about that figure, right? This figure here is showing you that for different people, the direct effect, which would be the intertemporal substitution effect, for example, is important, whereas for other people, it's not, right?
For who? Household or government?
For the household. This is all about households.
It's all households, so there is no government.
This model is so far a model about monetary policy. So is the monetary policy a government for you or not? Depends on. But I mean, maybe we can also discuss that later. I mean, this is a model about monetary policy, right? You can write down a Hank model with fiscal policy. I mean, I've shown you to do that in the New Keynesian model. You can also do that in a Hank model. There's actually a whole literature that does that, which is basically fiscal policy. Okay? Oh wait, further questions on this? All right, so then let me try to give you a bit of an idea of where I want to go next. Good. This is my last chapter. I mean, as I was already saying, this is now opening a very different box, right? So I know I'm going a bit back and forth, but the reason is that, I don't know, I was actually having a different order, and at some point people told me it's better to have the inflation part first, so this is why I gave in at some point. But actually the endogenous growth, what we're doing now, builds on exactly on chapter 4. Right? So basically what we're doing now is we like go back in time, right? Think about what we did in chapter 4 in the neoclassical growth model. So we have to go back now to a world where we care about the long run, where we care about growth, right? This is not a story about business cycles anymore. Not to say, this is basically what you were asking earlier, right? You can also combine these two things, right? I mean, you can do many things, right? But so far, let me start talking about more like this growth perspective. All right. So in these growth models, you have this issue, right, which is true in the solo model, which is true in the neoclassical growth model, that growth in the end, right, once you're converged to the balanced growth part, has always been exogenous, right? So there's like this exogenous process to productivity, and this is driving your growth in the long run, right? Remember, we talk about this solo growth accounting decomposition. Do you remember what was the result of that? I know I'm now a bit like switching topics, going back from inflation to growth. Takes a bit of a stretch, but what was the main result of this growth accounting?
Like from the steady state, which balance the capital and the labor input into some high cost ratio. It's kind of like
Yeah. So what I have in mind with this growth accounting was basically this data exercise, right? Where I said what already Solo did with this model was to say, look at US data, European data, and decompose GDP in the sources of growth. Where does it actually come from? And what he finds was this famous thing, it comes from technology, it comes from productivity, right? It does not come from capital, it does not come from labor, it comes from productivity, right? That was this important, I think very important finding, right? And this is why economists care so much about productivity, right? Okay. But now, I mean, that's exactly the point where I said, but in these growth models, productivity is just exogenous. So isn't that a bit disappointing? Don't you want to find a way to make that endogenous? And this is exactly what these models do, right? I want to make growth endogenous. Okay, so what I want to show you, maybe let me show you that. Yeah, sorry.
Oh yeah, okay. What can I measure in the productivity growth, for example, if that is not relevant with the capital, could be hard to think that what is still relevant in the growth model, for example.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
What can productivity be measured, so to say? If that is not coming from the capital, then I would hardly think that any other.
Okay, yeah, got it. I mean, think about our production function, right? So, I mean, you can take any from Douglas, right? I mean, just make it very general here, right? This here is capital, right? This here is productivity, right? So productivity has nothing to do with capital, right? I mean, productivity is how you use your capital and how you use your labor and how you translate it into output. But it's not necessarily related to capital.
It's the outcome, not income.
It's the outcome, not the income. This here is a production function. I'm defining that here as an income. Input.
Yeah, but income not measured in the money form.
Maybe let's discuss that later, but I mean, that's the idea, right? That's the production function that I have in mind. Let me try to give you the idea of what I want to show you in this chapter, right? It's basically, the first thing I want to show you is what we call the AK model. And the AK model is really like the most simple way to do it. You will actually laugh once you see how simple it is. Because the only thing that you will do is to basically say, instead of having these diminishing returns of capital, you get constant returns to capital, and that will allow you to have constant growth in your economy, right? And let me try to show you that, or give you the idea in a very, very simple setting, right? So again, we're basically back into the neoclassical growth model, but I mean, you've seen it, right, in my course, all these models hinge around this Euler equation. Here it is, right? So you have the Euler equation in the neoclassical growth model, right? Now my starting point is to say, I want to generate a model now which is able to give me constant growth in consumption, right? By the way, this is important now, this is taking it seriously. I'm not talking about output. I'm talking about growth in consumption, right? So from the Euler equation, you can actually see what you need for this, right? Here is consumption, tomorrow versus today, right? So growth in consumption would mean that CT plus 1 is larger than CT, right? And if CT plus 1 is larger than CT, this guy here is larger than 1, right? Over time, the whole time, right? That model would then not have a steady state where consumption is constant, right? Because here, I mean, that's the whole idea, right? We want consumption to grow over time, right? And now you can basically go and take just from the Euler equation what you need for that, right? And you will see that in order to get that, you will need that this left-hand side here, right, will be larger than 1. If you want the right-hand side to be larger than 1, this guy has to be larger than 1. Beta is just a parameter. Beta typically is smaller than 1. This implies that you need this guy here to be larger than 1. What is this guy? Well, that's the return on savings, right? That's our here, net capital range, right? What do we get from investing in capital, right? So what this implies is that this net return on capital has to be larger than 1 over beta for this whole term to be larger than 1, right? And that's one of these insights where we typically start with endogenous growth models. If you want to have endogenous growth, you need something in your model that makes sure that the net return on capital will be constantly higher compared to here, this discount rate. If you have larger models where you would also have population growth, whatever, you would also need to take into account that, right? So you need this return on capital to be high and to be constantly high, right? And that's basically the problem that we have in Solo and that we have in the neoclassical growth model, because this return on capital in the neoclassical growth model, I mean, we talked about that for quite some time, right? If you take our consumption, production function, this looks something like that, right? We talked about decreasing returns to capital for a long time, right? And decreasing returns to capital mean that once your capital starts to grow, your return on capital falls. And then this guy will at some point not be larger than the discount rate anymore. This was exactly the point where in these neoclassical growth models, and now we're approaching the steady state, this is where we are, right? But this is basically what we now want to get rid of, right? We want to dissolve, if you want, right? And this is, I mean, as I said, it's really as simple as it could be. The very simple idea what the AK model is doing, right? It's just saying, okay, then just get a different production function where the return to capital is linear, right? And then you already see where the name AK comes from. That's our production function. We just define output equals productivity times capital. AK, right? And this is linear, right? So if you were to plot this, right, here, capital output, that's what it would be, right? So the return on capital is always, or the marginal product of capital is always the same, right? What does that imply for our Inada conditions?
It means that at least this last part of the Inada condition is not
Exactly, right? This doesn't hold anymore, right? So that's now a very different animal that we're facing here now, right? But that's exactly what these models do, right? And I mean, now the model is actually basically already done, right? Now that's what you need, and now your model is done, right? You can, if you have this, you will know what the interest rate in your model is, because the interest rate is just equal to the marginal product of capital. This is just equal to A. So this is my interest rate, right? And now you have solved your problem, basically the problem that I made up here, right? If you need this interest rate to be constantly higher than that, you just need to make sure that your A is higher than that, right? And if this is true, you have solved your model already there, right? And the model per se is really as simple as it can be, right? And you can basically write it down. That's what I did here, right? So here you have this growth rate in consumption, right? And here you now see what it depends on. But it's basically just take this equation 1 and solve it for consumption, right? And then just insert here, this is for the marginal product of capital, I'm just inserting A, right? And then you have a model that defines, and that's now the important part, endogenously growth and consumption, right? So as long as this guy here is positive, you will have positive growth. Right? mean, in a way, that's what I have on this slide here, you will probably be a bit puzzled now, right? I mean, I made this whole point about, is that now really endogenous? It is endogenous, right? Because this model here would tell you, for example, that if you have an economy where productivity is increasing, or you compare two economies, right? So let's say one economy where productivity is higher compared to another economy, that model would predict that the economy with a higher A is growing by more, right? It would also mean something for the discount factor. An economy with a higher discount factor is growing by more, right? An economy with a lower discount, with a lower depreciation rate is growing by more. And this is something which in a neoclassical growth model we were never able to do, because in these models it was all about this exogenous process and nobody knew what this actually is determining. Here we can actually for the first time talk about what's actually determining growth. I mean, obviously this model is super simple, right? It's just not doing actually, I mean, maybe like in your words, this model is not useful to think about the real world because it makes all kind of weird predictions actually, right? The most simple way to think about it is like, there's actually no labor here, right? So what would that imply for the wage? What's the marginal product of labor in this economy? Well, it's zero. This economy has a zero wage. It would actually imply that basically here we're moving towards a world where all is just capital, right? And I mean, I don't know, maybe with AI this will be true, but so far this has never been true, right? So this model, right, is very simple, but it is, and I mean in a way that's also what I always said about the REC, right? It is so simple, but still it tells us something, right? It tells us that productivity drives growth, and this is basically solvable, right? And the only thing you needed to change was this production function, right? Okay. Let me just leave it with, I mean, sorry for pressing this into like this 10 minutes, but I just wanted to make this point first so that you kind of know where we're going, right? I mean, what I will do in this chapter now is like to show you different variations, right? I mean, nobody writes down a growth model, an endogenous growth model, and takes this production function seriously. Basically, what I will show you is different model versions that will come to a similar conclusion, right? But they microfound it, right? This here is not microfound. But that's really always the point, right? What you want to get in the end is something like equation 6. You can actually think about what is driving growth and consumption in the long run. Okay. Thanks for bearing with me, and I'll see you next week.
一个杯啊，我的天呐！然后那个盐马库斯直接要把我打死了那种感觉。然后他们都是一伙的，然后他们在拍的那种energy。So okay, fine, and we done all about the macro analysis, and the classes be recorded, and so that afterwards, if I can send to PB, I would be happy to, and to have some transcripts and etc. So that it's kind of like, yeah, we need to review about that. But I will maintain the Yulia Cope, and 甚至被呛死了，我感觉。然后前面的那个女生，然后问我要不要水，然后她就在说那些，然后但是我想，今天我就 totally cancer free 了，然后因为我这样的话，我就可以。OK。